Have you ever woken up one morning and realized that you've become the villain in your own story? That somehow, through a series of seemingly small choices, you've transformed from someone worthy of love into someone who destroys it. My name is Sophie Weber, or at least it was Weber until last month, and this is my confession. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something. I love my husband Lucas completely, still love him if I'm being honest. What I did wasn't about lack of love. Sometimes I think it would be easier if it had been. At least then, I'd have an explanation that made sense. But the truth is messier, more complicated, and far more painful. I'm 30 now, though this story really began when I was 24. I was already establishing myself as a wedding planner, building my reputation in Boston one ceremony at a time. It's ironic, isn't it? I spent my days helping other people create their perfect love stories while simultaneously destroying my own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Halloween party where it all began. October 31st, 2018. My friend Jennifer had transformed her Beacon Hill brownstone into a glamorous 1920s speakeasy. I'd spent weeks planning my costume. A champagne-colored beaded dress that shimmered when I moved, T-strap heels that made my legs look amazing, and a feathered headband that took forever to position just right. I even watched YouTube tutorials to perfect my finger waves and smoky eye makeup. I almost didn't go to the party that night. I just finished coordinating the disaster of a wedding where the mother of the bride had a meltdown over the flower arrangements 10 minutes before the ceremony. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and my feet were killing me from running around in heels all day. But Jennifer was one of my oldest friends, and I promised. You have to come, she'd insisted over the phone. I invited that guy from my office. You know, the one I told you about. He's totally your type. Jen, the last 3 guys you said were totally my type turned out to be either married, unemployed, or living in their parents' basement. Trust me on this one. He's different. She was right about that, at least. But the guy she'd intended to set me up with never showed up that night. Instead, I met Lucas. He was standing near the vintage bar Jennifer had rented, looking slightly uncomfortable in his pinstripe suit and fedora. Unlike most of the men at the party, who were playing up the gangster theme with fake machine guns and exaggerated accents, Lucas's costume was understated and elegant. He held his glass of whiskey like he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I noticed him watching me as I worked my way through the crowd, greeting friends and accepting compliments on my costume. Every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes would quickly dart away, and I'd catch the hint of a blush beneath his olive skin. Finally, after my 3rd circuit of the room, I decided to put him out of his misery. I sidled up to the bar, deliberately standing closer to him than necessary as I'd ordered a gin and tonic. Nice hat, I said, turning to face him. Al Capone. The smile that spread across his face transformed him from merely handsome into absolutely gorgeous. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and a dimple appeared in his left cheek that I would later spend hours kissing. More like a low-ranking member of his crew, he replied, adjusting the fedora self-consciously. I didn't want to seem too ambitious. Ah, playing it safe then. Usually, he took a sip of his whiskey. Though I'm thinking of making an exception tonight. Oh, and what kind of exception might that be? Well, he set his glass down and turned to face me fully. I'm normally terrible at talking to beautiful women at parties. But I've been watching you all night, trying to work up the courage to say hello, and I've decided that if I don't at least try, I'll regret it forever. I felt my cheeks warm. That's quite a line. Not a line, he said quickly. I'm actually terrible at those. I work in its security. The most exciting thing I usually say is, have you tried turning it off and on again? I laughed, and something in his expression softened. I'm Sophie, I said, holding out my hand. Lucas, he replied, taking it. His hand was warm and slightly calloused. I would later learn he played guitar in his spare time. Would you like to find somewhere quieter to talk? I promised to be a perfect gentleman. We ended up in Jennifer's library, talking until well past midnight. Lucas told me about his work in cybersecurity, making complex technical concepts sound fascinating rather than intimidating. I shared stories about crazy bridezillas and last-minute wedding disasters. We discovered we both loved old movies, Thai food, and had the same slightly dark sense of humor. "Your friend Jennifer," he said suddenly, during a lull in conversation. "She mentioned she was going to introduce you to someone tonight." I felt my stomach drop slightly. "Oh, are you him?" He shook his head. "No, that would be David from accounting. Nice guy, but he came down with food poisoning this afternoon. Lucky for me." "Lucky for you?" "Well," he smiled that crooked smile that was already becoming familiar. "If he'd shown up, you might not have noticed the awkward it guy lurking by the bar." I reached over and straightened his slightly askew tie. "I think I would have noticed you anyway." When the party finally wound down, Lucas insisted on calling me a car. He had too much whiskey to drive, and I'd had too many gin and tonics to argue. As we waited outside Jennifer's house, the cool October air making me shiver in my thin dress, he draped his suit jacket over my shoulders. "Can I take you to dinner sometime?" he asked, his breath forming little clouds in the cold air. "Maybe somewhere we don't have to chant over jazz music." I pretended to consider it. "I don't know. I'm pretty busy planning other people's romantic moments. Not sure I have time for my own." "I'll wait," he said simply. The sincerity in his voice made my heart skip. I pulled out my phone and handed it to him. "Add your number. But I should warn you, I have very high standards for dates. I plan weddings for a living, remember." He typed his number in carefully. I'd promised to exceed all expectations. And he did. Our first date was supposed to be dinner at a nice Italian restaurant, but when Lucas picked me up, he had different plans. He'd learned that I'd never been to the observation deck of the Prudential Center at night, so he took me there first. We watched the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "It's beautiful," I breathed, pressing my hands against the glass. "You're beautiful," he replied, and when I turned to give him a sardonic look, because really, how cheesy was that? The raw honesty in his expression took my breath away. After the sunset, instead of the Italian restaurant, he drove us to a tiny Vietnamese place in Alston that I never would have found on my own. The owner greeted him by name and brought us dishes that weren't even on the menu. I may have done some research, Lucas admitted when I expressed surprise at his knowledge of hole-in-the-wall restaurants. "I wanted to impress you." Consider me impressed. And I was. Not just by the effort he put into planning the evening, but by the way he listened when I talked, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. That first date turned into 2 years of the kind of courtship I'd previously only seen in romantic movies or helped plan for my clients. Lucas was thoughtful in ways that went beyond the usual flowers and chocolates, though there were plenty of those too. He remembered little details about things I liked and incorporated them into his gestures. When I mentioned missing the apple cider donuts my grandmother used to make, he spent a weekend learning to make them from scratch. After a particularly stressful wedding left me in tears, he ran me a bath with my favorite lavender oils and read to me from Pride and Prejudice. Even doing different voices for the characters, until I was laughing instead of crying. Our relationship wasn't perfect. No relationship is, but we handled our disagreements with respect and understanding. When Lucas got absorbed in work and forgot our plans, he'd apologize sincerely and make it up to me. When my spontaneous nature clashed with his need for planning, we'd find compromises that worked for both of us. The proposal came during a weekend trip to Cape Cod. Lucas had arranged a private sunset sailing trip, claiming it was just because I'd mentioned wanting to learn to sail. I should have suspected something when he insisted I dress up for it. Lucas usually preferred casual clothes, but I was completely surprised when he got down on one knee just as the sky turned pink. "Sophie," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you make every day of my life better just by being in it." He challenged me to try new things, to be spontaneous, to live life instead of just planning for it. "You're the first person I want to talk to when something good happens, and the only person I want to hold near when something bad happens. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me." He pulled out a ring box and inside was the most perfect engagement ring I'd ever seen. And I'd seen a lot of them in my line of work. It was his grandmother's ring, reset with modern touches. The original diamond now surrounded by smaller sapphires, the gold band replaced with platinum. "Will you marry me?" I was crying so hard I could barely get the yes out. But he understood anyway. The wedding planning was a dream and a nightmare rolled into one. As a wedding planner, I knew exactly what I wanted, but I also knew all the things that could go wrong. Lucas was amazingly involved in every decision, learning about flower varieties and cake flavors, helping me choose between different shades of blue for the bridesmaids' dresses. "You don't have to do all this," I told him one night as we pored over reception menu options. "Most grooms just show up on the day." He looked up from the catering samples with a serious expression. "This is our day, Sophie, not just yours. I want it to be perfect for both of us." The wedding itself was everything I dreamed of. We got married in the Boston Public Garden on a perfect June day. I wore a dress that made me feel like a princess, and Lucas cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. Our first dance was to "At Last" by Etta James, classic but not cliché. When Lucas dipped me at the end of the dance, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The first few years of marriage were even better than dating. We traveled whenever we could, weekend trips to Maine, a 2-week adventure in Italy, even a spontaneous road trip to Nashville, just because we were craving real Southern barbecue. At home, we were that couple that other couples invite. We hosted dinner parties where Lucas would cook elaborate meals while I decorated and entertained. I loved watching Lucas work from home, his forehead creased in concentration as he solved complex security problems. He'd get so focused he'd forget to eat, and I'd bring him coffee and sandwiches, kissing the top of his head. He'd grab me and pull me into his lap, saying work could wait 5 minutes. My wedding planning business was thriving. I had a waiting list of clients and had even been featured in several bridal magazines. Lucas supported me completely, even when I had to work weekends or take late-night calls from panicked brides. We balanced each other perfectly. Lucas was the steady one, the planner who made sure we had savings and insurance and everything adult life requires. I was the spontaneous one, driving him to midnight movie premieres or suggesting we try skydiving. He'd pretend to resist, but I could always see that spark in his eyes that said he loved my crazy ideas. Then Nick came home from Canada and everything changed. Lucas was excited about his cousin's return. They'd been close as kids, but hadn't seen each other in years after Nick moved to Vancouver for work. "You'll love him," Lucas kept saying. "He's like me, but with a better sense of humor." I should have been prepared for the way Nick looked. Lucas had shown me photos, but nothing prepared me for the reality of him. He was tall, taller than Lucas, with thick blonde hair that fell across his forehead in a way that seemed awfully messy. His eyes were the kind of blue you see in travel magazines featuring tropical beaches. When he smiled, one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other, giving him a perpetually mischievous expression. I threw a welcome home party for him at our house. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends, good food, and plenty of wine. Nick arrived fashionably late, carrying a bottle of maple whiskey from Canada and wearing a fitted blue button-down that made his eyes look even more incredible. "So you're the famous Sophie," he said, pulling me into an unexpected hug. Lucas didn't do you justice in his descriptions. I felt my face flush. "All good things, I hope." "He said you were beautiful and fun," Nick replied, still holding me a fraction too long. "He didn't mention you were stunning." Throughout the party, I kept finding myself near Nick. Or maybe he kept finding himself near me. We'd end up in the same conversations, laughing at the same jokes. His eyes would meet mine across the room, and I feel this little jolt of electricity. When he offered to help me clean up in the kitchen, I should have said no. "You're wasted as a wedding planner," he said, loading the dishwasher while I wrapped leftover food. "You should be a model." "Right," I laughed. "I'm sure the fashion world is desperate for 5'4", 30-year-olds. He stepped closer, taking the container from my hands and setting it down. "You don't see yourself clearly, did you?" "Nick, I started to say, but my voice came out breathy and uncertain. I know, he stepped back, raising his hands. You're married to my cousin. I'm just saying, you're extraordinary, Sophie. Lucas is a lucky man. That should have been the end of it. A mild flirtation at a party, nothing more. But Nick had moved into an apartment just 15 minutes from our house. He started dropping by regularly, usually when he knew Lucas would be home. We'd all have dinner together, watch movies, play board games. It was fun and innocent, at first. But there were moments when Lucas would go to the kitchen for more drinks, and Nick's hand would brush mine as he reached for the popcorn. Moments when our eyes would meet during conversation, and the rest of the room would seem to fade away. The text messages started innocently enough. Group chats about plans for the weekend, funny memes shared between cousins. But gradually, private conversations emerged. Nick would send me pictures of street art he found on his walks, knowing I loved that sort of thing. I share stories about difficult clients, and he'd make me laugh with his responses. The first real line was crossed after a game night. Lucas had an early meeting the next day and went to bed, but Nick and I stayed up to finish our wine. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, talking about relationships and life. I've never felt about anyone the way Lucas feels about you, Nick said softly. That kind of love, it's rare. It is, I agreed, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sometimes I think about that Halloween party where you met, he continued. What if I had been there instead of Lucas? What if you had walked up to me in that flapper dress? I should have shut it down right then. Instead, I took another sip of wine and asked, what would you have done? He moved closer, his knee touching mine. I would have taken one look at you and known I'd never let you go. The kiss, when it happened, felt inevitable, like falling off a cliff after edging closer and closer to the precipice. His lips were softer than I expected, and he tasted like wine and possibility. It lasted only seconds before I pulled away, my heart pounding. We can't, I whispered, but I didn't move away. I know, he replied, and kissed me again. What followed was 2 weeks of the most intense emotional turmoil I've ever experienced. Nick and I would meet in coffee shops far from our usual haunts, careful to choose places where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. We'd sit in my car in empty parking lots, talking for hours about everything and nothing. The tension between us was electric, dangerous. Every night, I'd go home to Lucas with guilt eating away at my insides. He'd greet me with a kiss and ask about my day, and I'd lie. The lies came easier each time, which somehow made everything worse. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Lucas noticed something was wrong, but attributed it to stress from work. He tried to take care of me in all the ways that had always worked before, running baths, cooking my favorite meals, giving me space when I seemed overwhelmed. His kindness was like daggers to my heart. You're working too hard, he'd say, massaging my shoulders as I sat at my desk, trying to focus on wedding details. Maybe we should take a weekend away, just us. The guilt was suffocating. It was my husband, the man who had loved me unfailingly for 6 years, planning ways to help me feel better while I was betraying him. I'd leaned back into his touch, closing my eyes against tears, wanting to confess everything but too afraid of losing him. Meanwhile, the situation with Nick was escalating. Our text conversations became more intimate, filled with things we shouldn't have been saying to each other. He'd send messages late at night, telling me he couldn't sleep because he was thinking about me. I'd respond, telling myself it wasn't really cheating if we were just talking. One afternoon, I ran into Nick at the grocery store. Actually, by accident this time. Lucas was at work, and I was shopping for ingredients to make his favorite lasagna, as if somehow making his favorite meal could balance out my betrayal. Fancy meeting you here, Nick said, his cart blocking the aisle. He was wearing gym clothes, his hair down from a workout. Shopping for dinner. Nick, we shouldn't, I started to say, but he cut me off. I miss you, he said quietly. I can't stop thinking about you, about us. "There is no us," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it anymore. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. "Have dinner with me tomorrow. Lucas has that conference call with Tokyo, right? He'll be working late." I should have said no, should have pushed my cart past him and gone home to my husband. Instead, I heard myself say, "Where?" We agreed to meet at a hotel restaurant across town. It seemed safer than a regular restaurant, less chance of running into anyone we knew. I told Lucas I had a client meeting about a destination wedding. The lie came easily, wrapped in enough truth to be believable. I did have clients considering destination weddings after all. I spent hours getting ready the next day, all while hating myself for putting in the effort. I chose a black dress that Lucas had always said was too sexy for client meetings. Did my makeup carefully, styled my hair. All the while, a voice in my head was screaming at me to stop, to call Nick and cancel, to confess everything to Lucas. The hotel was one of those luxury boutiques downtown, all modern art and mood lighting. Nick was waiting in the lobby, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit. He stood when he saw me, his eyes darkening as he took in my appearance. "You look incredible," he said, kissing my cheek in greeting. His lips lingered longer than they should have. We had dinner in the hotel's rooftop restaurant, with views of the city's skyline twinkling around us. The wine was expensive, the food excellent, but I barely tasted any of it. There was a tension in the air, an inevitability that we both felt, but neither acknowledged. After dinner, Nick suggested we have one more drink in the hotel bar. I agreed, knowing exactly what I was agreeing to. We sat close together in a dark corner, our knees touching under the table. His hand found mine, and I didn't pull away. "Come upstairs with me," he said softly. I got a room. I stared at our joined hands, at his long fingers intertwined with mine. "Nick, I love you, Sophie." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I know I shouldn't, but I do. And I think you feel something for me too." I did feel something. Attraction, certainly. A dangerous, explosive chemistry that made it hard to think straight when he was near. But love? No. What I felt for Nick wasn't love. Love was what I had with Lucas. Steady, deep, real. This thing with Nick was like a fever, burning hot but ultimately destructive. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I let him lead me to the elevator. Let him swipe the key card and open the door to room 1542. Let him pull me into his arms as soon as the door closed behind us. The kiss was different this time, harder, more desperate. His hands were everywhere, and I was responding with an urgency that frightened me. We stumbled toward the bed, shedding clothing along the way. Then my phone buzzed in my discarded purse. Once, twice, 3 times. Nick groaned against my neck. "Ignore it." I almost did. But something, guilt, fear, or maybe just self-preservation, made me pull away and check the phone. 3 missed calls from Lucas, followed by a text. "Need you home now. Emergency with Mom. Please call me." Reality crashed back like a bucket of ice water. Lucas's mother had been having heart problems lately. She'd already had 1 minor heart attack this year. If something had happened to her while I was here... "I have to go," I said, already pulling my dress back on. "Lucas's mom. There's an emergency." Nick sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Sophie, wait." "No!" I cut him off. This was a mistake. All of it. "We can't." "I can't." I grabbed my purse and ran, not even bothering to check my makeup or fix my hair. In the elevator, I tried calling Lucas back, but it went straight to voicemail. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely order an Uber. But when I got home, the house was dark. No Lucas. No emergency. Just a note on the kitchen counter in his precise handwriting. "Gone to Mark's. Don't wait up." Mark. Lucas's friend who worked in hotel security. My phone buzzed again. A text from Nick. "Lucas knows. He set us up. Mark saw us at the hotel and called him." I sank to the kitchen floor, still in my too tight black dress, and waited for my world to implode. Lucas didn't come home that night, or the next. When he finally returned 3 days later, he was eerily calm. 6 years, he said, sitting across from me at our kitchen table. 6 years of marriage, 8 years together, and you throw it all away for what? A few weeks of sneaking around with my cousin. Lucas, please. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Don't. His voice was ice. I talked to Nick, you know. He told me everything. Every text, every meet-up, every lie you both told me. He's on his way back to Canada, by the way. Couldn't get out of town fast enough once I confronted him. The betrayal hit me twice then. Not just my betrayal of Lucas, but Nick's betrayal of me. He promised we were in this together, that he loved me. But the moment things got difficult, he ran. I didn't sleep with him, I said, as if that made anything better. Lucas laughed, a harsh sound I'd never heard from him before. No, but not for lack of trying. If I hadn't called when I did. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I want a divorce. No, please. I was crying now, ugly, desperate sobs. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. Aren't of anything. There's nothing to fix, Sophie. You broke us. You broke everything. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. I already called a lawyer. They'll be sending you papers next week. The next few months were a blur of paperwork, moving boxes, and tears. Lucas was generous in the divorce settlement, more generous than I deserved. He let me keep most of our joint savings, saying he knew I'd need it to restart my business after the scandal died down. Because there was a scandal. Word got out. It always does in small communities, and suddenly the wedding planner who couldn't keep her own marriage together wasn't quite as appealing to prospective clients. I lost half my bookings within a month. Nick never contacted me again. Through mutual friends, I heard he'd taken a job in Vancouver, as far from Boston as he could get without leaving the continent. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he felt any guilt about how quickly he'd abandoned our supposed love when things looked difficult. But mostly, I tried not to think about him at all. I moved into a small apartment across town, adopted a cat named Fitzgerald after F. Scott, a reminder of that first Halloween party in my flapper dress, and started seeing a therapist. Dr. Chen helped me understand that what I'd done wasn't about Lucas at all. It was about me, about my own insecurities and need for validation. You had a man who loved you completely, she said during one session. But instead of recognizing that as valuable, you needed to prove you were still desirable to others. Why do you think that is? It took months of therapy to begin answering that question. To understand that no amount of external validation could fix internal emptiness. That the excitement of forbidden romance was really just a way of avoiding deeper issues. My business slowly recovered. Some clients stayed loyal, and others were drawn to what one bride called my redemption story. I learned to be more careful with their trust, knowing firsthand how easily happiness could be destroyed by careless choices. Lucas started dating again 6 months after our divorce was finalized. I saw them together at our old favorite restaurant. A pretty redhead who looked nothing like me. They were holding hands across the table, and he was looking at her the way he used to look at me. I wanted to hate her, but I couldn't. She probably deserved that look more than I ever had. As for me, I'm learning to live with my choices. Learning to forgive myself while never forgetting the lesson. Learning that sometimes the hardest consequences of our actions aren't the external ones, losing a husband, a home, friends, but the internal ones. The knowledge that you're capable of hurting someone who loved you completely. The understanding that trust, once broken, leaves scars on everyone involved. I still organize weddings, helping other couples start their journeys together. Sometimes during the ceremonies, I hear the words for better or for worse and feel my chest tighten. I know now what those words really mean, what they demand of us. I know because I failed to live up to them. If you're reading this and feeling tempted by something, or someone you know you shouldn't want, remember my story. Remember that the moment of giving in might feel like freedom, but it's really the first step into a cage of your own making. Remember that the people we hate the most are often the ones who loved us best. I don't know if I'll ever find love again. I'm not sure I deserve to. But I do know that if I'm ever lucky enough to stand before someone and promise, for better or for worse again, I'll understand exactly what I'm promising. And this time, I'll keep that promise. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I take out my wedding album and look at the photos. Lucas and I dancing, cutting the cake, sharing secret smiles. We looked so happy, so certain of our future together. I wonder if there was anything I could have done differently, any moment where I could have stopped the chain of events that led to our destruction. But that's the thing about choices, you can't unmake them. You can only learn from them and try to do better next time. So that's what I'm doing. Learning, growing, trying to become someone worthy of the kind of love I threw away. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough for now.